Well, welcome back to our study of the book of Job, and we're in lesson 3. In some ways, it seems like we've been in it for a while. There's much that's going on. We're just now getting ready to look at chapter 2. And as you saw on the screen, while we're looking at when life falls apart, we're also looking at a very important question that Job is going to ask himself as we look at today's lesson. Life or death? If you have your Bibles, open them up to Job chapter 2. And we're going to be looking primarily at chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. There is some important information we want to look at with regard to Job's response in chapter 3. But we'll note as we go through that Job is not alone in the way he has felt going into his suffering. You know, one of the things that we can think about as we go through this lesson is how much we have suffered. As of the present recording, the world is seeing Russia invading Ukraine, and there is unrest. We don't know what is going to happen, and that's on a global level. Each of us then has to think about what's going on in our own lives. We've mentioned some generic things like people being sick or losing jobs, relationship problems, financial problems, and we just know that while we can weather some of those storms, to keep the metaphor going, at times when it keeps pouring and pouring and pouring, we despair. And we see that in Job's life as well. What we looked at last week was the first wave, as I said, of the attacks of Satan. They were couched in terms of both human and natural intermediary, if you will. What we'll look at with today's lesson is that there is a further attack where, if we want to say it this way, Satan takes things into his own hands. And so we'll see further how Job will respond. And what we'll do is we'll look at what happens to him and then look at some of his own reflections as to what will go on in his life. And of course, we still have a long way to go with at least 10 more lessons after this one, where we'll see Job interact with his friends and be concerned about how to make sense of what's going on in his life. And then, of course, we will see God's response at the end. Well, today's lesson looks at a number of things in chapter 2 and in part of chapter 3. And so let me go ahead and go through the outline first. And then what I want to do is then walk through that text, as always, little by little. We're going to call today's attacks the second of Satan's attack. The first time we called it the first wave of attacks. That's because he attacked in waves, if you will. Here there will be one attack, and we'll see what happens. So what we're going to find as we look at the text in verses 1 to 6, we're going to see the second council. Again, what's going to happen is God is going to be meeting with the sons of God, the angels, and his heavenly council, and the Satan is going to return. And there will be further dialogue between God and the Satan. What we're going to then see after that conversation is Satan does offer up his second attack on Job in chapter 2, verses 7 to 8. And then what we're going to see is Job's second response, a very short statement. This is going to include the first and only mention of his wife and her response to Job's such situation and her counsel to him in what he should do. What we're going to see then is the second progress report, looking back as the narrator will identify what it is that Job did in response to this next attack. And then we're going to jump into the beginning of the reflections of Job's suffering. And that's going to include really chapter 3, verse 11 and verses 20 to 26. I'm actually going to have us look a little sooner than that, because there is information in the beginning of chapter 3. Now, what that means is we are skipping a little portion of text that we'll bring in next week, because in the next lesson, what we're going to see is that Job is not alone. He is going to be, I will say, counseled, or he will be in some ways comforted, but certainly what's going to transpire beginning next week and into several lessons after that is the interaction of Job with his friends, trying to make sense of what's going on in his life. And it will be rather interesting to see what happens there. Well, what I want to do is break up the reading into the various parts and then walk through it slowly. As we walk through it, I want you to think about the fact that there are going to be some parallels between the structure of this text that we're looking at and what we read in the previous lesson. Now, a lot of that is because it happened that way. A lot of it is because it works literarily and narratively. You see this interchange back and forth, and it helps to see, one, the character of God, and the character of the Satan, but also the author has an opportunity for us to see how things play out and with some subtle changes to the parallel structure to incorporate some things that are reflective of the first meeting that they had. Let's read verses 1-6 together. It says this: again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came along. He came among them, I should say, to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to the Satan, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face." So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power, or in your hand. Only spare his life." Well, again, we see this meeting between the sons of God and the Lord, and we have again the Satan introduce himself, so to speak. And what I mean by that is it seems as if he just brings himself to the council. And what we see then there is, as this meeting is going on, the Lord stops down and asks, "Where are you coming from? What have you been up to?" The same thing as last time. Now, keep in mind, of course, that what has happened prior to this is that Satan has now attacked Job. He has lost his cattle, he has lost his children, and he has lost many, many, many of his servants. And so he is there alone with a few servants, and then, as we'll see today, his wife. What we're going to see now is the response to all of that. What sets it up for now, though, is a similar parallel, or something parallel to what we saw last time. Where have you come from? The same response that Satan gave the first time, he gives again. He's been roaming around. The Lord then responds in the same way he did the first time and says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Now, part of what we have taking place here is, again, because this is a follow-up, this is an opportunity for the Lord to kind of tell Satan, "I told you he was going to be faithful to me, and yet you're here again." So last time we talked about the fact that God could have just told Satan in this meeting that's coming up, "Hey, we already proved that Job is faithful. He doesn't serve me just because I've blessed him. Why don't you be gone now?" What happens, though, is we're going to see in the response, in this interchange, that there is more to go, because Satan is not rebuffed by this. He's going to be speaking very strongly against God and against Job at this point. One of the things we see God say about Job in this instance is that he tells to Satan, "Job still holds fast his integrity." And then he repeats the description of Job, as we saw at the beginning of the book of Job and in God's description of Job to the Satan. He says he is one who is upright and blameless, one who fears God and shuns evil. And he goes on to say that this is one who has held fast his integrity, regardless of the fact that you incited me against him to ruin him without cause, for no reason, without justification. In other words, Satan just didn't care, and there was no reason to test Job. It was clear on God's side that Job was a man of integrity and one who would hold up regardless of what he had suffered. Well, Satan then makes a couple of comments. One of them is rather strange and often difficult to understand, and we'll try to make a little sense of that. The other one, of course, is very plain. The first thing he says, and you can note the vindictiveness in the Satan's voice as he responds to God. And doesn't it kind of surprise you as you read this text that someone would speak to God like that? What does he say? He says, "Skin for skin." Now, some might say that, well, he only did skin deep. He wasn't hurt. You never touched him. It could mean that there's something along the lines of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the idea of retaliation. There are a number of other ways that this can be understood, but certainly what Satan is doing here is he is accusing God. You held a hedge around him. You protected him. We'll see that coming up. And what God says to him is that what we're going to see is, well, you can go and do more, but there's going to be a limit, and we'll see that in a moment. So in saying skin for skin, basically, uh, Satan is accusing God. He's telling God that he, Satan, was right in this sense. And of course, he's twisting the perspective. He said, yes, he did stay faithful, but you limited me in what I could do. What you did is, in this first opportunity that I had against Job, you were protecting him. You had a hedge around him. That word there is similar to what we see in chapter 1, verse 10. There was a hedge around him. And so Satan says, you weren't playing fair. You put too many limitations on me. It's very clear, though, if I'm able to actually touch him, then I will be able to get to him, and he will curse you to your face. So there's a greater challenge and charge, or another accusation. He goes on to say that, as you read the text, he goes on to say that, let me get it real quick. He says, one, skin for skin, and then he says, all that a man has, he will give for his life. And basically what the Satan is saying here is, if you let me attack his life, actually personally, he'll do anything to save his own life, even if that means cursing. And we see that kind of runs contrary to reason. If you think about it, what would be the end of someone who would actually curse God? Well, it would be someone who would turn their back on God, someone who in that instance would separate themselves from God. How is that then saving his life if he gives up everything? But of course, the rhetorical aspect of it, if we attack Job to the point that we get to his body, then ultimately what can happen is he will reach a breaking point. He'll do anything, he'll say anything, if it will mean that he could be relieved of this suffering. He says this, just let me touch, well, he's actually saying to God, touch his bone and his flesh. Now notice the levels of attack here that are being projected. Skin for skin, he's basically saying you've been protecting him. And then also he goes on to talk about bone and flesh. He's talking about another level of attack. Let me get to him. And what we're going to see, of course, is there will be an attack on Job that will impact his entire body, not only his skin, but even below the skin. And in essence, then what Satan is telling God is, you need to remove the hedge. You've put too much protection around him. Let me really touch him. Notice how bombastic, and I couldn't come up with another word. You could probably come up with other words to describe the audacity of the Satan at this point. He's bombastic. He is disrespectful. He is rude, if you will. It is amazing the tone that we can sense the Satan is using here with God. It's almost like not only has he accused Job of only serving God because God has blessed him, but he's now accusing God because he won't let him actually do what he wants to do. He thinks that God is playing a game with him. And the reality is, as we saw in the previous lesson, as we'll see here, God is doing none of the sort. Notice the challenge. He says, if I'm able to touch him, go down to his bone and flesh, then he will curse you. Well, what do we see? We see God granting permission. There's still the limitation, and it's interesting. And it's a necessary limitation. And if Satan has any reason in him, he would recognize this. God says he's in your hand, he's in your power, only spare his life. Now, you might think, well, what's significant about that? That's the ultimate thing, is to take his life. But think about this. If God lets Satan actually take Job's life, now we know Job, being faithful, would enter into the presence of God. That would be a really checkmate against Satan, because Job then wins anyway. He's in the presence of God. But the other thing is, Job's challenge to God is that, or Satan's challenge to God is that Job is going to curse God. If Job is killed, there is no blessing or cursing. We saw last week when Job encountered all of the affliction that he faced, he blessed God, he praised God, he worshiped God, he recognized both the good that God gives and the good that he takes away. So if Job actually dies, then Satan can't get Job to actually curse God. So God tells him, you cannot take his life. That's still giving a lot of freedom to Satan at this point. So keep that in mind. What we have then is the challenge. What we have then is the second round. And what we're going to see next is what Satan actually does. If you look at chapter 2, verses 7 to 8, we have Satan's second attack, and it reads this way. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Just as last time, we saw that Satan left the presence of the Lord. But then when the first attacks came against Job, they were, as we said, by human intermediaries and natural disaster. What we see here is that Satan leaves the presence of the Lord, and it says he smote Job. So there's a direct attack here. This is something that is not something that Satan would leave into someone else's hands. He is going to, quote, have the privilege or have the honor, if you will, to attack Job himself. That way, there will be no way of anyone in the middle, so to speak, messing things up. There's a direct attack by Satan. Now, the affliction. It's hard to say exactly what's going on. Some have said that this is some form of leprosy, and yet when you read the idea of the sore boils, it runs deeper than that. And we see that Job is afflicted in such a way that he's going to put himself on the ash heap and then scrape himself with shards of pottery, if you will. He's reaching an itching point that the only relief from the itching perhaps is the pain of scraping. There are other things that are going on. There are a number of other things that scholars have looked at to try and figure out what Job has done. And what they have done, and I won't do it here today, but what they have done is they've gone through the book of Job and noted the kinds of things Job has said about the feeling physically that he has endured. And as you read through the text, there are a number of things that have gone on there. And it's really comprehensive. It's something that he is despairing of because of the pain. And as I said, there are a number of things that we're looking at, but really, the most important thing is that Job is now afflicted personally and physically. It's no longer things outside of himself, things that are a part of his family or things that he owns or people that are a part of his household. It's him personally. And so what we see here is Job is now seeking to bring some kind of relief to himself. Maybe in a future lesson, we can go back and look at a couple of the things that might be illustrative, if you will, the things that Job has been suffering at this point. The author's most important concern is that Satan has carried out what he has challenged. He has attacked Job's body, and Job is afflicted. And so he is not only in pain, you're going to see that he's going to feel alone, and he's doing what he can in his own mind to try to alleviate that pain, even if it means inflicting pain to cover up other kinds of pain. We don't know all that Job was being afflicted with, but we do know that it was something unbearable. Well, what we see, though, is in verses 9 and 10a, we're going to stop partway through, is Job's second response. Now, here we're going to see the first mention, and only words of Job's wife. And we'll try to balance out what's going on with that as we go, because I do think that while there may be room, if you will, to criticize his wife, we might want to be a little sympathetic with her, but then also see what role she is playing in the narrative with regard to the idea of what wisdom is and what foolishness is. Let's read verses 9 through 10. It says, "Then his wife said to him, 'Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die.' But he said to her, 'You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?'" Well, in rabbinic tradition and Jewish tradition, there are actually names, different names that have been given for Job's wife. One is Dinah, which goes back to the book of Genesis, and representing another wife who was kind of critical of a husband. There are other names given. We're not given any names here, and that's not the significant thing. One thing I want you to think about, though, is the fact that as wisdom literature, what this document is trying to do is teach us about the wise response. And that means taking counsel from wise people. One of the things we see Job being able to do here is, even in his suffering, he's able to root out what would be considered foolish talk. Now, it's important to note that Job's wife is not being called a fool, but she is speaking in a foolish way. because the words that she speaks, these two imperatives that she's giving Job, are not the wise choice. They are not the way that a wise person would respond. And that's a word to the reader about reflecting on what is the wise response in suffering. He says, she asks him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Notice where this is coming exactly as the way God described Job. He is still holding fast to his integrity, despite the fact that the Satan has afflicted Job in so many ways. Even now, as he is suffering, and we don't know how long this has gone on before she speaks up, she asks, are you still holding fast your integrity? So she raises the question such that she's recognized that he's already been through a lot, and now he's going through more. And whatever he has said or has done, which is not recorded up to this point, she can ask him, are you still holding fast your integrity? It's amazing that you haven't turned on God. And so she then gives him the challenge, curse God and die. Now, obviously, we talked about the word cursing God in a previous lesson. It's literally the idea of bless God, but the idea there is to speak in such a way that you would disown God if you would. In other words, turn your back on God. He has not done anything good for you. And now the word die there could be the idea of just let yourself die then, or it could mean that by cursing God, God himself would bring the final, if you will, death blow to Job. And so, it could be either one of those. But the challenge that she's facing here is one of despair. Now, let's balance this out. As I said a moment ago, we look at this comment and we want to be very, very critical of his wife. And the point of the author is to be critical of her through Job's words, of course. But I also want us to think about this. Job is the centerpiece of the story, but she's lost as well. She's lost her children. Her husband is suffering, and if he dies, she loses everything, all of his livelihood. There is nothing left for her if he dies. There would be no property left for her. There's nothing. And so she's been afflicted as well. What it shows, however, is that her response is different from Job's. But I want us to keep in mind that what she's going through is what Job has gone through. And now she is seeing her own husband die. She's already seen her 7 children die. And now she sees her husband suffering. Is she responding in the same way Job is responding? Absolutely not. But she's probably responding in a way that many would. And that is that there is a despair that calls into question God's benevolence, God's love, God's power, and for some, even God's existence. Now, she believes that God exists. She says to Job to curse God. But perhaps you know many people who have been through difficulty, and maybe you have been one of them at times. And we brought this up in a previous lesson, that what ends up happening when someone goes through a difficult time is they wonder if God even exists, and even if he cares. And through all the suffering and struggle that someone goes through, I've even heard people say this, well, if God really does exist, then when I see him after I die, then he'll have some questions to answer for me. And I just shudder to think about that, because as we'll see Job respond later, God is still sovereign. God is still in control. God owes us nothing. And as a result, anything that we endure, we were never going to be in a position to tell God, you need to answer to me. That's going to be an interesting statement as we go through some of the comments that Job will make to his friends later. But notice what Job says immediately here. After she asks him, are you still keeping your integrity? Curse God and die. He says to her, you're speaking as a foolish person. And then asks her a question. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? Now, I'm reading the New American Standard Version, the 1995 edition, and many of your translations are going to speak similarly. But these are the Hebrew words tov and ra, the words that we use for good and evil. Now, clearly, this is not moral evil in the sense that God is wrong in what he's doing. In fact, Job never accused God of any wrongdoing. That's what we learned in the previous lesson. But of course, the broader range of meaning of the word ra for evil is a kind of word that you would see with adversity or struggle or calamity and things like that. But Job is recognizing that ultimately God, as we said, either causes everything or he allows everything. Nothing happens without his permission. And we are seeing that now for the second time as Job is being attacked by the Satan. He asks a question: shall we not accept good from God and not accept adversity or evil? Shall we accept only the good but not the other? Those are hard words to listen to. I commend Job very greatly for that. Many of us think that the only thing God owes us is good. And as I said a moment ago, technically, God owes us nothing. And we'll see the way Job is going to respond ultimately in a moment with regard to his feelings about himself, though he never sins. Let's go ahead and look then at verse 10b. This is the last section of this first part where we see the second progress report. The author then tells us, after he speaks to his wife, Job in all of this did not sin with his lips. Now, earlier it said he did not sin or blame God of any wrongdoing. Here it simply says he did not sin with his lips. Now, many would say, well, maybe he was thinking it even though he didn't say it. The reality, though, is that oftentimes, more than oftentimes, what comes through the lips is coming from within the heart already. Remember what Jesus said later? He says it's not what goes into a person's mouth that makes them unclean, it's what comes out. Because what comes out of the mouth is what's from inside. It comes from the heart, it comes from their inner being. So for Job not to sin with his lips means that it did not enter into him to sin. He did not sin. Now, it doesn't say anything about going on and not cursing God. It doesn't say anything about praising God at this point. It's very short, but you have to recognize that in the literary fashion that this is given, that can be assumed. His response to his suffering is the same as it was before. What we're going to see now, beginning in chapter 3, is a set of poetry that will extend into basically chapter 41, where ultimately Job is going to be reflecting upon his suffering. His friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are going to weigh in and describe to Job why they think he's suffering. And then later on, we're going to see Elihu, another friend who's been sitting on the sideline, so to speak, waiting his turn patiently, but at least in his own mind, he's waiting patiently. And then we will see God's response. And so we'll walk through those passages. We won't be able to go through all of those passages. We'll go through representative portions to see exactly what it is that Job is saying and what his friends are saying. We are skipping to the end of chapter 2 to get to the beginning of chapter 3. And what I want us to see is while Job can be upfront about accepting the good from God and the bad from God, he still has some kind of response that is understandable. Now, real quick side note, we've said that the wife appears and now is not mentioned ever again. Satan has brought this affliction on Job, and we don't hear from him again either. There's not a third meeting. We don't know what goes on there, but certainly Job has received that second affliction. And then what we have is simply now Job pondering what it is that he is going through. If you want to think of it this way, it could be that Satan just sits back and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, because after this, there's no reason to go back to God, because what we're reading about is Job's constant reflection and interchange between his friends about what God is bringing on Job. It's important to recognize as we continue on, though, that God will still be accusing Satan, because he says, you have incited me without cause. Clearly, Job is innocent. Job is someone of integrity. And so it's still back on Satan himself. Well, what we want to look at then are these initial reflections. And while we do want to read a part of chapter 3, verse 11, and then 20 to 26, I want to read a couple of verses of chapter 3, simply because I think it's important that we note the start of this. What we are going to see in chapter 3 then is the beginning of the poetic section. And I want to make this comment before I forget. We often talk about suffering and reflecting upon suffering. Imagine all of the work that the author has put in as you read through the book of Job. Imagine all of the work that has been put in to take all of these reflections and all of these thoughts and not just report the thoughts in a kind of prose form or something that would seem more reasonable to us in many ways, but takes the time to put these in poetic form. Now, it's Hebrew poetry, so you're not going to see all the rhyme there. You'll see a number of parallelisms and different kinds of parallelism to describe the different ways that the thoughts are being conveyed in relationship to one another. But this means that a lot of effort has been put into preparing this text for future readers that they may also reflect. And what they're going to read, and what you and I can read, is how they reflect upon what Job is enduring and what Job is reflecting upon as what he's enduring from a particular perspective. I won't give that perspective away just yet, but what we're seeing is eventually all of Job's friends and Job will agree on one theological fact. We'll talk about that moving forward. The problem for Job is he's saying that fact doesn't apply to me. Let's look at a couple of verses in chapter 3 that highlight for us what it is that Job initially responds. I do have it here. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. Notice, we're going to talk about the friends later. Job begins to talk after a time of silence, and he says this in chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. Afterward, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived." Notice in all of this, he never cursed God, but he did despair of the day of his own birth. Now, this is important. I want us to point this out, that he is not blaming God of any wrongdoing. He's still in despair. He's still struggling. He's still suffering. What he does is he turns inward and he starts to think logically. He curses the day that he was born. He says, "Let the day on which I was born to perish, the day which I was to be born, and let the night which said a boy is conceived." In other words, let it all go away. He says basically this, as we'll read on. Essentially, what would have kept him from suffering in life is if he had never been born. And perhaps you've heard people despair of that, such that they would say, one, in such anger, I didn't ask to be born. I wish I had never been born. And of course, to never have been born is to never have suffered. And yet we'll know that there are so many other blessings that come from being given the gift of life and having been born, because it's the only opportunity also and the only way that you'll be blessed and have a relationship with God. I want you to keep that in mind. What he curses is not God, but the day of his birth. And you might think that that's troubling in and of itself. You think, well, that's got to be a sin, right? What's going on here is Job is having this conversation now with his friends, as we'll see, but he is recognizing that having been born has led to his suffering. Had he never been born, he would have never suffered. Notice what he says in verse 11. And I really want to encourage you to read all of chapter 3. We're only looking at a portion of this to set the tone of what Job is feeling. He says in verse 11, "Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire?" Again, what you're hearing is how much affliction Job is feeling. He's not emotionless. It's very real to him. And he does speak out. He just doesn't curse God. And then we'll read verses 20 through 26 in total there. And then we'll bring in a couple of other things to think about moving forward, because it's important to recognize that we think about Job in this regard, but he's not the only one who's ever spoken like this. And we'll bring in a couple of other people. He says, "Why is light given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, but there is none, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice greatly and exult when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in?" Pick up on that word. "For my groaning comes at the sight of my food, and my cries pour out like water. For what I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. And I am not at rest, but turmoil," let's say that word, but turmoil comes. Notice he curses the day of his death. He's despairing of life. And as I said, that might be relatable to us. I think we've all been in a position where we've either been so sick we feel like the only relief is to die. Some people feel like they can relate to Ecclesiastes, where it seems like life isn't fair. where you see the wicked prospering and the righteous failing, or falling, or suffering, or you find that maybe you have had it all, but it doesn't mean anything. There's a meaningless to life. What Job is going through is something that we can all relate to. Now, I venture to guess that some of us feel kind of hesitant to say that we have suffered as much as Job has, but I grant you that there are many, many people in this world who have suffered, if not more, at least as much as Job. And here is a word for us. Here is an example of someone who has gone through this. And we have the book of Job then to help us work through this and process this. Also, not only talking about Job, but then, if you will, as we'll see in future lessons, giving us permission to speak to God and ask God questions. We need to recognize then Job's suffering. Notice all that he's going through. One, he talks about being hedged in, but notice the other things that he's talking about. Now, I just cry to the point of despair. The only relief I'll have is in the grave. Groaning at the sight of food. Maybe his appetite has been lost because of all that he's gone through. Here is a person who is someone who feels like the only relief will come if he were never born. He doesn't necessarily ask for death, and he's certainly not going to kill himself, but he recognizes that living right now is not pleasant. It's less than desirable. And so I won't belabor that point. I want you to reflect upon that and think about that, all that Job has gone through. But as I said a moment ago, Job is not the only person that has gone to the point of feeling like this. You remember in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4-8, after Elijah has defeated the prophets of Baal, then he's being pursued by Queen Jezebel, and he feels that he is all alone. He is despairing of life. He just wants to die. He feels all alone. Jeremiah in chapter 20 of his book, verses 14-18, he's despairing of life and wants to die. Let me give those verses to you again so you can go back and look those up. We're not going to read those. 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4-8, and Jeremiah 20, verses 14-18. And then think about this, the lament psalms in the book of Psalms. You realize that there are more lament psalms in the book of Psalms than there are of other types. It shows that humanity has despaired of life over and over and over again. Living is suffering, if you will. And sometimes that suffering is brought upon us by ourselves and our own decisions. Some of that suffering is unexplainable, as we mentioned in the first lesson. The problem or the issue is that since we all suffer, we all try to figure out what's going on. We try to understand exactly what it is that's happening, and we want to make sense of it. At this point, Job isn't worried about trying to make sense of it. He's just despairing of life, and he wants to be dead, even though he's not going to do it himself, and he's certainly not going to curse God to precipitate that. Notice here that as we conclude, Job did not sin. It's very clear. These words are very important. And that's important to keep in mind when we read the rest of this book and hear all that Job has to say on behalf of himself and in the way that he will call on God for vindication. He does not sin. He accepts the adversity. He accepts both the good and the evil from God. He accepts that adversity. What he wants is an explanation, but he still despairs of life. And I think we need to recognize there's a balance there. I think some people think if you feel despondent, if you feel negative about what you're going through, and if you're not just saying, oh, well, we all accept everything from God, if you actually feel hurt and you feel in pain and you question what's going on and why are you suffering, you feel like for some reason that's a lack of faith in God. What Job is showing us is a balance then between a strong faith in God, a trust in God, an integrity in and of himself, that he is not going to curse God. He's not blaming God for any wrongdoing in all of this. And yet he can despair of life. It is possible to hold both one's faith in God and one's feeling of despair and emptiness and aloneness, and we can keep those in balance. Okay? I think it's important that we recognize how important that, I think it's important we recognize that we can keep that balance. I think too many times we're guilted into thinking if I feel bad, if I'm questioning God, or if I have certain feelings with all that I've been dealing with, that I just don't have faith in God. And unfortunately, we have people tell us that. And what we're going to see ultimately with Job's friends is they're going to try and accuse him of things to get him to just at least confess you did something to deserve this. Job is an example that trusting in God, staying true to one's commitment to God, and acknowledging God as the source of suffering and attributing even the suffering to him, and yet despairing of life, in other words, being so distressed of life that you want to end it, those things are not at odds with one another. They're human emotion. One is a commitment to God as well as one's inner feelings. It's possible to hold both and not be a contradiction. I want us to recognize that. Job is teaching us here, the book of Job is teaching us that it is possible to have strong faith in God and still have despair of life, because he's enduring a lot of pain. He's dealt with a lot of loss, and he's dealing with a lot of personal pain now as well. Maybe you have been so sick or gone through so much that you feel like the only option is to end it. Maybe you've actually had suicidal thoughts. Maybe you've not, but you just say it in despair. Those are human emotions. I would hope that you would seek help in that, but I also hope that you would seek good counsel. Job gets counsel from his wife, and he says that's not good counsel. And the word then to the reader is, that's not good counsel. It's not good counsel to curse God. We'll see it's okay to ask God, but not curse God. And maybe you are feeling like it's something that is difficult to hold in tandem with one another. How can I say I believe in God if this is the way I'm acting and this is the way I'm feeling? Job, I think, sets us free to recognize that you can have a strong faith in God and still struggle with what's going on in life. Anyone would not want to ever have suffered. Let me rephrase that. Looking back on Job's statements about he would never have suffered had he never been born, clearly none of us want to ever suffer. But now that we've been born, we know that there is going to be suffering that comes along. We know that God can be there for us. Some questions then. I've asked up to this point as we focus on our response. Now, let me repeat those questions. I've said, do we have such a faith that God would commend us to adversity, or to commend adversity to us with confidence of our passing the test? And I rattled through that last week, in a difficult way. I'm doing it again here. Let me rephrase the question as we think about what's going on here. One, do we have such a faith in God, have such integrity, that God could put us or allow us to be tested, knowing confidently that we would pass the test? Second question, thinking about Job's reaction, both in the first wave and in the second attack, how do we react when calamity attacks us? One of the things we see here is certainly Job keeps his faith, but we do see him start to wonder what's going on. He doesn't sin. He trusts in God, but he still despairs of what he's going through. Here's another question. Have you known friends, family, coworkers, acquaintances, classmates, etc., who have stated that the reasons they had for, quote, leaving the faith or not believing in God at all were the troubles that they have faced in life? We see a number of people who are leaving the faith because they have no answer for what is going on in their life. Trouble comes, and they think because God is supposed to bless them, that when they feel suffering in their life, they go through struggles, then what happens is they say, well, God must not exist, or he certainly doesn't love me and care. Certainly the problem of evil is a great challenge to the Christian faith, both from an intellectual and philosophical standpoint and from a personal standpoint. How do I endure this and think that God really exists? A number of people, and I won't name names, that are famous out there, their quote testimony is that they couldn't get a good explanation as to why bad things happen. And sometimes it's not even about what happened to them, it's about what they see in the world. How can God really exist? You probably have known people who have either quote deconstructed, or what's happened is they've just left the faith altogether because they have gone through difficult times. It does say something about their view of God. I'm not criticizing that view of God at this point, but I'm thinking it's not a mature thinking about God, because it's a limited view of God. Without being overly critical or condemning or condescending, I want to ask this. Doesn't that, in other words, they're leaving, doesn't that reveal something about the nature of their faith in the first place? Doesn't it reveal their faith in God is based only on what they can get from God or what they think he can and should do for them? Think about what Satan accused Job of doing. He only believed in God because God blessed him. Some people are even taught this, that God is blessing you if you have faith in him. Some people perhaps have a faith that is very limited and may be immature, that when trouble comes, they have no way of processing that because their view of God is honestly too small. Again, I want to balance using that word again with the idea of recognizing people are at different levels of faith, challenging us to be people of faith such that we can endure and know that God is going to get us through it and we can still ask God questions. But I also want to recognize that there's a place for us to think about what's going on. Let me kind of summarize that again. We know people that have left, and they are saying it's because they can't believe in that kind of God. What kind of God do they believe in? Job was someone who recognized that regardless of the source of his suffering, ultimately God has allowed it, and yet he keeps his faith in God. It does say something about our faith. Now, again, for you personally, I want to encourage you, and in a moment I'm going to be praying for you, because I know that as you struggle and suffer, what's happening is you are processing what is God like and how could he let this happen. Job is an example of someone who believes in God, is trusting in God, is faithful to God, and yet is suffering and recognizes and can voice his own despair about it. And I think we want to work on that as well. The testing, suffering, and hardship that people endure reveals the genuineness of one's faith. Of course, handled correctly, trusting in God, such testing can cause growth. And at this point, I'd take you to Romans chapter 5, where he talks about what suffering can lead to. James 1 talks about what suffering can lead to in a positive way, the maturity and the patience and so forth. First Peter in chapter 1 talks about struggling and suffering as it will test the genuineness of our faith. Job's genuineness or the genuineness of Job's faith is being tested here. Satan has said he only believes in you, God, because you bless him. But Job is proving that his faith is genuine. The question is, how genuine is our faith? Well, what I want to do as we conclude is I want to pray for you and me and recognize that as we deal with a very difficult text like this, and we deal with a very difficult text like the book in Job of Job in general, suffering is real. It's not like other world religions that say there's no such thing as evil, or that say there's no such thing as suffering. It's all illusion. Christianity says suffering is real. Pain is real. And we know that God is there with us in the pain. And he may not give us the explanation for the pain in this life, but certainly he is with us. So I just want to take time to pray for you, whoever you are, wherever you are, and whenever it is that you would be viewing this. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for this lesson. We thank you first for the example of Job and his faithfulness to you. We thank you for his candor and his honesty about his feelings and as he's gone through his own suffering. And we thank you for the way he is going to try to figure out what's going on in his life, why he's suffering. And so I just pray right now for anyone who is watching this, that you would show yourself to them. Be present with them in their suffering. Lord, whether it is something that you are causing to bring them to faith in you or you're allowing, I pray that they would see you as big and that you are truly God in control of all things, and that you accept the questions, you accept the challenges, you accept the despair, the words of crying out, oh God, why? So I pray for the person who is dealing with a deadly disease. I pray for the one who is imprisoned. I pray for the one who is being abused. I pray for the one who is dealing with financial despair. I pray for the one whose loved ones are going through such difficult times. Lord, you know the person who is watching this right now. I just pray that you will touch that person and let them know it's okay, I'm here with you, and that they would turn to you. And I pray that you would bring people into their lives such that they would be good counsel to them, that they would be those who would lead this person to you, and that they can seek you and know that you will be found when they seek you with all their heart. I just pray, Father, right now that you will help us to continue to live this life. We know to live is to struggle. But I just ask right now also that you would have each one know that you are there. We know you are there. We know that you understand, because you also have suffered in volunteering your son, and your son giving his life for us that we may have relationship with you. And so you understand what it is to lose a loved one. You understand the gravity and weight of sin, and you have alleviated that by taking that punishment. Knowing that you have been through that, I pray, Father, we would still turn to you and recognize our comfort comes from you. I do ask, Father, that you would bring peace, comfort, and strength to those who are going through difficult time. I pray that you will let them know that it's okay to feel despair. I do pray, Father, you'll be present, as I've said. We know you're a good God. We love you and praise you, and thank you for what you're going to do in our lives. We thank you for your son. We pray that you'll continue to give us encouragement and boldness by your Spirit. We pray this all to your glory. Amen. Well, as we continue next week, we want to go ahead and think about Job and what he has been dealing with. And one of the things we're going to see is eventually he's not alone. We're going to see Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And you can see there on the text on the screen, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 3 verses out of chapter 2. We skipped those today. And then we're going to skip around a little bit. We're going to look at chapter 22, verses 5 to 6, and verses 9 through 11. But as we do that, I want you to be thinking about reading through some of that on your own. You won't be able to get everything. I mean, you could read it all by the next lesson, but the point is there's a lot to digest there. We're going to get a sample of that here now, and then through the coming lessons, the exchange between Job and his friends. But it's important to recognize that through this, Job has had counsel from his wife. Job is going to be with his friends, and he's going to, in some way, try to wrestle with this issue of suffering. As we said in the prayer, living is suffering. And we know that God is with us. We know that as we go through this, we can be strengthened. I pray that you will be strengthened. I pray that you'll be honest in your emotion with God. He's a big God. And knowing that, it means that we can trust him. And as I can say, maybe too colloquially, he can take it. We can be honest with God. And I pray that you would be, so that you would seek him. Because if anything, being honest with God means what? You are maintaining that relationship with God. You're at least reaching out to him. And I want to encourage you in that. Till next lesson, I pray that you will be blessed and that you will be well.